My daughter-in-law Jessica's face went completely white as she realized that the burdensome old woman she'd been hiding in a converted storage room for the past 8 months had just walked into the family Thanksgiving dinner carrying an eviction notice with her name on it, and that the helpless elderly mother she'd been treating like an unwanted houseguest was actually the sole owner of the $850,000 home she thought belonged to her husband. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I have something even more shocking to share about what happened when the sheriff showed up with the moving truck. The room assignment conversation happened on a humid Tuesday evening in March, delivered with the kind of fake sweetness that barely concealed what everyone in the family knew was a calculated power play. After living peacefully in my own home for 8 months since my son Marcus and his wife Jessica moved in to help me with daily tasks, I was being relocated to what used to be a storage closet because Jessica had decided we needed to optimize the space for better family functionality. "Mom Walsh, we've been thinking about the living arrangements," Jessica had announced during dinner, her voice carrying that practiced tone she used when she'd already made decisions and was simply informing everyone else. With Marcus working from home now and me starting my consulting business, we really need to convert your master bedroom into a proper home office. The storage room off the kitchen has great natural light, and we can make it really cozy for you. The storage room was an 8x10 converted pantry with a tiny window, barely large enough for a twin bed and a small dresser. It had been used to store holiday decorations, seasonal clothing, and boxes of books that didn't fit in the main house. Now, according to Jessica, it was going to be my new private retreat space, where I could have everything I need without worrying about being in anyone's way. "Jessica, that room doesn't even have a proper closet," I'd said carefully, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. "And it shares a wall with the kitchen. It's going to be noisy when you're cooking or entertaining." "Mom Walsh, we've thought about all of that," Marcus had replied, not quite meeting my eyes while Jessica nodded approvingly beside him. "We can install some sound insulation, and we found this amazing wardrobe system online that'll give you plenty of storage. Plus, think about how much easier it'll be for you to access the kitchen and living areas without having to navigate the stairs to the master bedroom." I'd stared at them both, processing what was really happening. After 32 years of raising Marcus as a single mother following his father's death, after working 2 jobs to put him through college, after watching him graduate with honors and start his successful career in software development, after welcoming Jessica into our family and opening my home to them when they said they needed to save money for a house down payment, I was being moved to a storage closet so they could have my master bedroom for their business ventures. "But this is my bedroom," I'd said, gesturing toward the master suite where I'd slept for the past 15 years, where I'd recovered from my hip surgery 2 years ago, where I'd spent countless nights reading and watching old movies since Marcus's father died. "This is where all my things are, where I'm comfortable." "Mom, you need to think about what's practical," Jessica had said with that patient tone people use when they're managing someone who's being unreasonable. "You're 70 years old, and those stairs are getting harder for you to manage. The storage room is on the main floor, closer to everything you actually use during the day. It's really a much more sensible arrangement for someone at your stage of life." Someone at my stage of life. The phrase hung in the air like evidence of a verdict that had already been decided. At 70, according to Jessica's assessment, I had reached the stage where my comfort, privacy, and personal space were secondary to their business needs and lifestyle preferences. This wasn't the first time Jessica had made unilateral decisions about my living situation. Over the past 8 months, there had been a series of suggestions and improvements that had gradually eroded my authority in my own home while positioning Jessica as the person who understood what was best for everyone. It had started subtly, just 2 weeks after they moved in. I'd been having my morning coffee in the sunroom, a ritual I'd maintained for over a decade, when Jessica appeared with decorating magazines and a measuring tape. Mom Walsh, I've been thinking about this space, she'd said, gesturing around the glass-enclosed room that overlooked my garden. It's getting so much natural light, and with my new consulting business, I really need a place where I can meet with clients that feels professional and welcoming. Would you mind if we converted this into a proper meeting space? Jessica, this is where I have my coffee every morning. It's my favorite room in the house. Oh, of course. And you can still use it for your coffee. I'm just thinking about maximizing the potential of the space. We could get some beautiful furniture that works for both purposes. Comfortable for your morning routine, but professional enough for client meetings. Within 3 weeks, the sunroom had been completely transformed. The comfortable reading chair, where I'd spent countless hours, was replaced with a sleek glass conference table. My collection of plants had been streamlined to a few modern succulents. The cozy throw pillows and soft lighting that had made the space feel like a retreat were replaced with stark professional decor that made it feel like a corporate boardroom. "Doesn't it look amazing?" Jessica had said when the transformation was complete. "So much more sophisticated and functional. And you can still have your coffee here. Just think of it as having coffee in a beautiful modern space instead of that cluttered reading nook." But of course I'd stopped having my morning coffee in the sunroom. The space no longer felt like mine. The glass table was always set for potential client meetings, and Jessica had made it clear that my coffee routine shouldn't interfere with her business needs. I'd retreated to the kitchen for my morning ritual, telling myself it was a small compromise to help Jessica establish her consulting practice. The kitchen invasion had come next. Jessica had decided that my cooking schedule was inefficient and that we needed to coordinate meal planning for better family nutrition. What this meant in practice was that Jessica took over the kitchen during prime cooking hours, preparing elaborate meals for her client dinners while relegating me to eating simple snacks during off-peak times. "Mom Walsh, you've been cooking for yourself for so long, it must be nice to have someone else take over the heavy lifting," she'd said while commandeering my kitchen for a 3-hour client dinner preparation. "Why don't you just focus on simple things like sandwiches and salads? All that standing and stirring can't be good for your joints at your age." My joints were fine. I'd been an excellent cook for 50 years, and I enjoyed preparing meals that were more complex than sandwiches and salads. But Jessica had systematically scheduled her cooking sessions during the times when I would normally prepare dinner, effectively pushing me out of my own kitchen under the guise of helping me avoid unnecessary physical strain. The living room had been next. Jessica had determined that my furniture was dated and not conducive to entertaining. Over the course of 6 months, my comfortable sectional sofa had been replaced with minimalist chairs that looked beautiful but were uncomfortable to sit in for extended periods. My collection of family photos had been curated down to 3, carefully selected images that fit Jessica's aesthetic vision. My bookcases had been reorganized to display Jessica's design objects rather than my reading collection. "This space flows so much better now," Jessica had explained while I surveyed what used to be my living room. "Clean lines, uncluttered surfaces, everything intentionally placed. It's so much more relaxing than all that visual chaos you had before." Visual chaos. My family photos, my books, my comfortable furniture, the things that had made the space feel like home, had been reframed as clutter that needed professional management. Each transformation had been presented as an improvement. That would benefit everyone, but the cumulative effect was that I'd been systematically displaced from every common area in my own home. The sunroom was Jessica's office. The kitchen was Jessica's domain during prime hours. The living room was Jessica's showcase space that I was welcome to use as long as I didn't disturb the carefully curated aesthetic. But the bedroom demand represented a significant escalation in Jessica's campaign to reshape my living space according to her preferences. Previous changes had focused on common areas where she could argue that shared spaces should reflect shared input. The master bedroom was unambiguously my private space, and Jessica's demand that I relocate to a storage room represented a fundamental shift in how she saw my role in the household. "Jessica, I appreciate your concern about the stairs, but I've been managing them just fine. I'd prefer to stay in my own bedroom. But Mom Walsh, it's not really about what you prefer anymore, Jessica had continued, her mask of sweetness slipping just enough to reveal the steel underneath. It's about what makes sense for the whole family. Marcus and I are building our careers, and we need a professional space where we can meet with clients and conduct business. We can't do that from a storage room. Then maybe you should consider renting office space, I'd suggested, though I already knew from their expressions that this conversation wasn't actually about finding solutions. It was about informing me of decisions that had already been made. Mom, office space is expensive, and we're trying to be financially responsible while we save for our own place, Marcus had said, finally looking at me directly. It just makes sense to use the resources we have available here. The resources we have available here. My bedroom had become a resource that they were entitled to optimize for their benefit. The language they used was particularly telling. Jessica consistently framed her demands as suggestions while making it clear that my preferences were secondary to practical considerations. Marcus spoke about financial responsibility and making sense, as if my comfort and privacy were luxuries that the family couldn't afford given their business needs. Neither of them acknowledged that they were guests in my home who were asking me to relocate to a closet so they could take over my bedroom. Neither of them seemed to recognize that their financial goals didn't automatically supersede my right to comfort and privacy in my own house. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to discover in the 8 months since they'd moved, into what they assumed was the family home, was that the house they were reorganizing to suit their needs belonged entirely to me. The deed was in my name alone. The mortgage had been paid off for 3 years. The property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs were handled through my accounts that they had never seen or inquired about. Marcus and Jessica had moved in under the assumption that this was a multi-generational family arrangement where everyone contributed to household management and decision-making. They had no idea that they were actually guests in my home, guests who were now demanding that I relocate to a closet so they could take over my bedroom for their business ventures. The house had been purchased in 1995, 2 years after Marcus's father died, and left me with a modest life insurance settlement. I'd used that money as a down payment on what was then a $185,000 three-bedroom colonial in an up-and-coming neighborhood in Riverside, Oregon. For 28 years, I'd made every mortgage payment, handled every repair, managed every upgrade, and navigated every property tax increase. The neighborhood had transformed dramatically over those nearly 3 decades. What had been a working-class area with modest homes and young families had become one of the most desirable residential districts in the city. The coffee shop on the corner had been replaced by a gourmet restaurant. The small grocery store had become an artisanal market. The modest homes had been renovated and expanded, and property values had skyrocketed. My house, which I'd purchased for $185,000 in 1995, was now worth approximately $850,000, according to the most recent property assessment. The mortgage had been paid off completely in 2020, 3 years ahead of schedule, using funds from my retirement accounts and savings that I'd accumulated during 45 years of working in property management and real estate law. But Marcus and Jessica knew none of this financial history. When they'd moved in, ostensibly to help me with daily tasks while saving money for a house down payment, they'd never asked about the mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance costs, or any of the financial responsibilities that come with homeownership. They'd simply assumed that the house was some kind of family asset that everyone had input into managing. More significantly, they had no idea about my professional background or the expertise I'd developed over 4.5 decades in real estate and property law. When I'd retired 5 years ago, I'd simply told Marcus that I was stepping back from work to enjoy my golden years. I'd never detailed the specifics of my career, the level of responsibility I'd held, or the specialized knowledge I'd accumulated. Eleanor Patricia Walsh, the burdensome elderly mother they were managing like a housing problem to be solved, had spent 45 years working for Riverside County's largest property management company. I'd started as a receptionist in 1978 and had worked my way up to senior property legal specialist, a position that required extensive knowledge of tenant rights, eviction procedures, property ownership laws, and residential housing regulations. During my career, I'd handled over 1,000 tenant disputes, processed hundreds of evictions, managed complex family housing arrangements, and provided legal guidance for property owners dealing with difficult residents. I'd seen every possible variation of the situation I was currently experiencing. Family members who moved into elderly relatives' homes and gradually assumed control over living arrangements. Adult children who treated their parents like tenants rather than homeowners, and multi-generational housing situations that had deteriorated into power struggles. I knew exactly what legal protections I had as the sole property owner. I understood precisely what rights Marcus and Jessica had as residents who had never been added to the deed or the mortgage, and I was intimately familiar with the eviction procedures that applied when family members overstayed their welcome, and began making demands that crossed the line from helpful suggestions to hostile takeovers. More importantly, I understood the psychology of housing disputes and the progression of behavior that typically led to serious legal conflicts. Jessica's pattern of gradually taking control of common spaces while positioning herself as the decision-maker was textbook behavior for someone who was testing boundaries and building toward a larger power grab. The bedroom demand wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable next step in a systematic campaign to establish herself as the primary authority figure in the household. If I agreed to move to the storage room, the next demand would be restrictions on my use of common areas during her business hours. Then, limitations on visitors who might interfere with their professional activities. Then, suggestions that I should consider assisted living or senior communities that would be more appropriate for someone my age. I'd seen this exact progression dozens of times during my career. Adult children who moved in to help elderly parents gradually convinced themselves that they were doing their parents a favor by taking control of household decisions. They reframed their parents' preferences as obstacles to overcome rather than wishes to respect. They positioned themselves as the rational, practical family members who understood what was really best for everyone involved. The end result was always the same: elderly homeowners who were systematically displaced from their own properties by family members who had convinced themselves that their takeover was actually generous assistance. But what Jessica and Marcus didn't understand was that the helpless elderly mother they were managing had more experience with these situations than they could possibly imagine. I'd helped dozens of property owners navigate similar family conflicts. I'd processed evictions for adult children who had overstayed their welcome and refused to respect their parents' authority. I'd provided legal guidance for elderly homeowners who needed to reclaim control of their own properties. I knew exactly what documentation was required, what procedures needed to be followed, and what timeline was involved when family members needed to be legally removed from properties they didn't own. More importantly, I understood that Jessica's behavior wasn't going to improve with gentle conversation or family meetings. People who systematically push boundaries and test authority aren't deterred by requests for respect or appeals to fairness. They're only stopped by consequences that make their behavior too expensive or too risky to continue. Standing in my own dining room, listening to my son and daughter-in-law explain why I needed to move to a storage room so they could take over my master bedroom, I felt the peculiar clarity that comes from recognizing a pattern you've seen many times before. Jessica wasn't trying to help me with daily tasks or create better family functionality. She was systematically taking control of my living space while positioning herself as the decision-maker in my own home. And Marcus, my son, whom I'd raised to be respectful and considerate, was enabling her behavior because he'd convinced himself that managing his elderly mother's living arrangements was somehow his responsibility and his right. But what neither of them understood was that the elderly mother they were managing had resources, knowledge, and legal authority that they had never bothered to discover. And the storage room they wanted to relocate me to was about to become the launching point for the most educational experience either of them would ever have about property ownership, tenant rights, and the consequences of underestimating Eleanor Walsh. The conversation ended with me agreeing to think about their suggestions while they exchanged satisfied looks across the dinner table. They thought they'd successfully negotiated my relocation to the storage room. They thought they'd demonstrated appropriate concern for my well-being while securing the space they needed for their business ventures. What they'd actually done was provide me with documented evidence of their intention to take over my bedroom while treating me like a tenant, rather than the homeowner, and that documentation was going to become very important in the weeks that followed. That evening, after Marcus and Jessica had retired to the guest bedroom they'd been occupying since moving in, I retrieved a legal pad from my desk and began documenting everything I could remember about their behavior over the past 8 months, every unilateral decision about my living space, every time they'd treated my preferences as obstacles to overcome rather than wishes to respect, every instance where they'd positioned themselves as the practical family members who understood what was really best for everyone. The sunroom takeover, the kitchen schedule manipulation, the living room redesign, the bedroom demand. All of it followed a clear pattern of gradually assuming control while framing their behavior as helpful assistance. But I also documented the financial reality they'd never bothered to investigate. My sole ownership of the property, my responsibility for all housing costs, my legal authority as the homeowner, their status as guests who had been welcomed into my home under specific circumstances that they were now violating. Over the next few days, I discreetly gathered the documentation that would be necessary if this situation escalated to formal legal proceedings. The property deed showing my sole ownership. The mortgage satisfaction letter proving the house was owned free and clear. The property tax records showing my responsibility for all ownership costs. The insurance policies that covered the house and its contents. I also retrieved the informal agreement Marcus and I had discussed when they first moved in, an email exchange where he'd assured me they would respect my authority as the homeowner and that their residence would be temporary, while they saved money for their own place. There was no formal lease agreement, which meant they were legally classified as guests rather than tenants, giving me significantly more authority over their resident status. Most importantly, I researched the current legal procedures for removing unwelcome family members from private property in Oregon. The laws had changed somewhat since my retirement, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Property owners had broad authority to determine who could live in their homes, and family relationships didn't override property rights when conflicts arose. In Oregon, homeowners could legally require adult children to leave their property with 30 days written notice, regardless of how long they'd been residing there. If they refused to leave after the notice period, formal eviction proceedings could be initiated through the county court system. The process typically took 60 to 90 days and resulted in sheriff-enforced removal if necessary. But there were also informal alternatives that many families used to resolve housing conflicts before they escalated to legal proceedings. Sometimes the threat of formal eviction was enough to motivate voluntary relocation. Sometimes family meetings with neutral third parties could help establish new boundaries and expectations. Sometimes financial incentives could encourage temporary residents to prioritize finding their own housing. I had options. I had legal authority. I had professional expertise. And I had documentation that clearly established my rights as the property owner. What I didn't yet have was a clear strategy for addressing Jessica's behavior in a way that would preserve my relationship with Marcus while protecting my authority over my own living space. As I lay in my master bedroom that night, possibly for one of the last times according to Jessica's timeline, I felt something unexpected rising in my chest. Not the resigned acceptance they probably expected, not the grateful compliance they'd hoped for, not the quiet submission that would make their takeover easier. I felt anger. Clean, focused, empowering anger. But underneath that anger, something even more powerful, the kind of focused determination that comes from spending 4 decades handling property disputes and difficult housing situations. The clarity that comes from recognizing manipulation for what it is, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing exactly what legal protections you have when someone tries to push you around in your own home. I thought about all the elderly homeowners I'd helped over the years who had found themselves in similar situations. Widows whose adult children had moved into help and gradually assumed control over household decisions. Elderly men whose families had convinced them to sign over property rights for estate planning purposes, and then discovered they'd lost all authority over their own homes. Senior citizens who had been systematically displaced from their own properties by family members who justified their behavior as necessary care and assistance. In every case, the solution had been the same: clear documentation of property ownership, firm enforcement of boundaries, and formal legal proceedings when family members refused to respect the homeowner's authority. I'd helped dozens of property owners reclaim control of their homes. I'd processed evictions for adult children who had overstayed their welcome and refused to acknowledge their parents' rights. I'd provided guidance for elderly homeowners who needed to establish new boundaries with family members who had taken advantage of their generosity. Now I was facing the same situation from the other side. I was the elderly homeowner whose generosity had been misinterpreted as weakness. I was the property owner whose adult child and daughter-in-law had gradually assumed control over household decisions. I was the person who needed to reclaim authority over my own living space before the situation deteriorated further. But unlike many of the elderly homeowners I'd helped over the years, I had professional expertise that Jessica and Marcus couldn't imagine. I understood property law, tenant rights, and eviction procedures better than most attorneys. I knew exactly what documentation was required, what timeline was involved, and what outcomes were possible when family housing arrangements broke down. First house, storage room they wanted to move me to was about to become the command center for a lesson in property law that Marcus and Jessica would never forget. The elderly mother they thought they could manage was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when you tried to relocate someone who actually owned the deed to the house. You were trying to reorganize, and the family dinner where they'd announced their plans for my bedroom was going to be remembered as the moment when Jessica made the biggest mistake of her married life. The storage room assignment was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. I had 14 days to prepare them for the most educational experience they'd ever had about the difference between being a guest and being a homeowner, and it was going to be absolutely unforgettable. What Jessica didn't know as she celebrated her successful room optimization with Marcus that evening was that the mother she had just relegated to a storage closet was sitting on legal authority and property expertise that could have prevented 10 housing disputes of the scale she was creating, and that the woman she'd dismissed as a burdensome elderly relative who needed management had spent the last 45 years handling situations exactly like this one, just always from the position of legal authority rather than victimhood. While Jessica saw me as a confused widow whose main challenge was adjusting to the reality of shared living spaces, the truth was that Eleanor Patricia Walsh had been quietly building and managing what had become one of the most comprehensive understanding of residential property law in Riverside County. My expertise wasn't just theoretical knowledge picked up from legal handbooks. It was practical, hands-on experience gained from processing over 1,000 housing disputes, managing complex family property arrangements, and providing legal guidance for situations that would make most people's heads spin. But here's the thing about being systematically underestimated by your own family. You learn to keep your professional achievements and specialized knowledge private, because every time you've tried to share your expertise in the past, they've found ways to dismiss it or suggest that your experience is somehow irrelevant to modern situations. When I'd mentioned to Marcus 3 years ago that my property management work had been featured in the Oregon Real Estate Journal as a case study in innovative approaches to complex housing disputes, his response had been, "That's nice, Mom, but are you sure you're not making your work sound more important than it actually was? Property management is mostly just collecting rent and handling maintenance requests, right?" When I'd told him that I'd been invited to testify before the Oregon State Legislature about proposed changes to tenant protection laws, testimony that had influenced the final legislation, he'd said, "Mom, you need to be careful about getting involved in political stuff. Sometimes retired people can get confused about how government actually works, and you don't want to embarrass yourself by offering opinions on things you don't really understand." When I'd mentioned that I'd been approached by Portland State University to guest lecture in their real estate law program about complex family housing situations, Jessica had interrupted, "Mom Walsh, you should be focusing on relaxing and enjoying retirement, not taking on stressful commitments that might be overwhelming for someone your age. Teaching requires a lot of energy and preparation, and I don't want you to overcommit yourself." Every professional achievement had been met with concerns about my stress levels, warnings about potential confusion, or suggestions that I should scale back and not overextend myself at my age. So I'd learned to keep my expertise to myself, while Marcus and Jessica continued to see me as a well-meaning retiree whose biggest challenge was figuring out how to fill her days productively. The reality was far more impressive than anything they'd ever imagined. My career at Riverside County Property Management hadn't been a typical administrative job. It had been a specialized position that required extensive legal knowledge, complex problem-solving skills, and the ability to navigate emotionally charged family situations where property ownership and personal relationships intersected in complicated ways. I'd started at the company in 1978 as a receptionist, but my natural aptitude for understanding legal documents and my ability to communicate, clearly with distressed property owners, had quickly caught the attention of senior management. Within 2 years, I'd been promoted to property legal assistant, a position that involved helping homeowners understand their rights and options when dealing with difficult tenants, family housing disputes, or inheritance-related property conflicts. By 1985, I'd earned my real estate license and completed certification programs in property law and residential housing regulations. The company created a new position specifically for my skill set, Senior Property Legal Specialist, a role that made me the primary resource for homeowners dealing with complex legal situations involving their residential properties. Over the next 38 years, I'd handled cases that would have challenged experienced attorneys. Elderly homeowners whose adult children had gradually assumed control over their properties and needed legal assistance to reclaim authority. Families where inheritance disputes had created multiple competing claims to single properties. Situations where long-term guests had established squatters' rights and needed to be formally evicted. Complex cases where property ownership was disputed due to unclear documentation or fraudulent transfers. My specialty had become what the industry called family property conflicts, situations where personal relationships and property ownership rights created legal complications that required both technical expertise and emotional intelligence to resolve. These were the cases that other property management companies referred to us because they were too complex or too sensitive for standard procedures. I'd developed what became known throughout the county as the Walsh Protocol, a systematic approach to documenting, evaluating, and resolving family housing disputes that minimized emotional trauma while protecting property owners' legal rights. The protocol had been adopted by 3 other property management companies and was taught in real estate law courses at 2 Oregon universities. But perhaps most relevantly to my current situation, I'd handled dozens of cases involving adult children who had moved into their parents' homes under the guise of providing assistance, then gradually assumed control over household decisions and living arrangements. These cases typically followed a predictable pattern that I could have described in my sleep. Phase 1. The adult children moved in temporarily to help with specific challenges, recovery from illness, financial difficulties, or general aging. Concerns. They presented themselves as supportive family members who wanted to ensure their parents' safety and comfort. Phase 2. They began making suggestions about household management, living arrangements, or daily routines that would improve the parents' quality of life. These suggestions were always framed as being in the parents' best interest and were presented with concern for safety, efficiency, or practical considerations. Phase 3. The suggestions became expectations, and the parents' preferences were increasingly framed as obstacles to overcome rather than wishes to respect. The adult children positioned themselves as the rational, practical family members who understood what was really best for everyone involved. Phase 4. The adult children began making unilateral decisions about household management, often taking control of common spaces or establishing rules that prioritize their needs over the parents' comfort and privacy. Phase 5. The situation escalated to demands that the parent relocate within their own home, modify their lifestyle, to accommodate the adult children's preferences, or accept reduced authority over their own property. Phase 6. If the parent resisted these changes, the adult children often threatened to withdraw their assistance or suggested that the parent was becoming difficult or unreasonable and might need more structured care. Jessica had just completed Phase 5 by demanding that I relocate to a storage room so she could take over my master bedroom. If I agreed to her demand, we would inevitably progress to Phase 6, where my resistance to future demands would be used as evidence that I was becoming unable to manage my own household and needed more supervision. I'd seen this exact progression literally hundreds of times during my career. I'd helped property owners at every stage of this process. I'd documented the patterns, developed intervention strategies, and guided families through resolution processes that protected the homeowner's rights while preserving relationships when possible. But I'd never been on the receiving end of this systematic manipulation until now. What Jessica and Marcus also didn't understand was that 45 years in property management had given me access to a network of professionals who could address every aspect of the situation I was facing. I didn't just understand property law in theory. I had working relationships with the attorneys, court clerks, sheriff's deputies, and legal aid organizations who would be involved if this situation required formal resolution. Judge Patricia Hendricks, who handled most residential property disputes in Riverside County, had worked with me on over 50 complex cases during my career. She knew my reputation for thorough documentation and fair resolution strategies. If this situation ended up in her courtroom, she would give my testimony the weight that came from decades of professional credibility. Sheriff Tom Bradley, who supervised the county's eviction enforcement team, had collaborated with me on numerous family housing disputes where law enforcement intervention had been necessary. He understood the emotional complexity of removing family members from properties and had often complimented my documentation processes for making difficult situations more manageable for his deputies. Attorney Michael Chen, no relation to the UCI Chen family from our wedding story, had been my go-to referral for property owners who needed legal representation in complex housing disputes. He'd handled dozens of cases where my initial assessments and documentation had provided the foundation for successful legal outcomes. If I needed formal legal representation, Michael would prioritize my case because he knew my work and trusted my judgment. More importantly, I had access to resources that could resolve this situation without formal legal proceedings if Marcus and Jessica were willing to approach it rationally. Property mediation services that specialized in family conflicts. Financial counselors who could help them understand their actual housing options. Real estate professionals who could assist them in finding appropriate housing that fit their budget and business needs. I had options that Jessica couldn't imagine, resources that Marcus had never heard of, and professional relationships that had been built over decades of handling situations exactly like the one they'd created. But what I didn't yet have was a clear understanding of how far they were willing to push this conflict before they recognized that they were dealing with someone whose expertise far exceeded their assumptions. The morning after the bedroom demand, I began implementing the documentation process that I'd refined through decades of handling property disputes. Every conversation, every demand, every instance of boundary-crossing behavior would be recorded with the kind of detail that would hold up in formal legal proceedings if necessary. I started with a comprehensive timeline of Jessica's systematic takeover of my living spaces over the past 8 months, the sunroom conversion that had displaced my morning coffee routine, the kitchen scheduling that had pushed me out during prime cooking hours, the living room redesign that had eliminated my comfortable furniture and personal belongings. Each incident was documented with specific dates, direct quotes when I could remember them, and detailed descriptions of how my living situation had been affected. But I also documented the financial reality that Jessica and Marcus had never bothered to investigate. My sole ownership of the property, evidenced by the deed that was filed with the county recorder's office. My responsibility for all ownership costs, including property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and utilities. The mortgage satisfaction that proved the house was owned free and clear, with no liens or encumbrances that would give anyone else claim to the property. Most importantly, I documented their legal status as guests in my home. The informal email agreement when they first moved in, where Marcus had assured me they would respect my authority as the homeowner and that their residence would be temporary. The absence of any formal lease agreement, rental payments, or legal documentation that would give them tenant rights or protection. From a legal perspective, Jessica and Marcus were in an extremely vulnerable position. They had no ownership interest in the property, no tenant protections, and no written agreement that would give them any claim to continued residence. They were guests who could be asked to leave with 30 days written notice, and who could be formally evicted if they refused to comply. But more significantly, Jessica's behavior over the past 8 months had created a documented pattern of boundary violations and unauthorized control over my property, her systematic takeover of common spaces, her unilateral decisions about household management, and her demands that I relocate within my own home could be presented as evidence of hostile behavior that justified immediate removal rather than the standard 30-day notice. I had legal grounds to require them to leave immediately if I chose to pursue that option. I also had the documentation necessary to obtain a restraining order if Jessica's behavior escalated to harassment or intimidation. And I had the professional relationships and expertise necessary to navigate whatever legal processes might be required to protect my rights as the property owner. But beyond the legal considerations, I understood the psychological dynamics that were driving Jessica's behavior, and that would determine how this situation evolved. Her systematic boundary pushing wasn't random or impulsive. It was a calculated strategy to establish herself as the dominant authority figure in the household while positioning me as someone who needed her management and guidance. Jessica had likely convinced herself that her takeover of my living spaces was actually generous assistance. In her mind, she was helping a confused elderly woman make better use of her property while ensuring that the family's resources were optimized for everyone's benefit. She'd reframed my preferences as obstacles to overcome rather than wishes to respect, and she'd positioned herself as the practical family member who understood what was really best for the situation. This psychological framework explained why she was able to make increasingly unreasonable demands while maintaining her self-image as a helpful daughter-in-law. She wasn't trying to be cruel or manipulative. She was trying to be efficient and practical. She genuinely believed that converting my bedroom into her office space was a logical use of available resources, and that my resistance to the plan was evidence of inflexibility rather than a reasonable assertion of my rights as the homeowner. But this psychological framework also meant that gentle requests for respect or appeals to fairness were unlikely to change her behavior. People who have convinced themselves that their boundary violations are actually helpful assistance, don't respond to subtle corrections or diplomatic suggestions. They interpret resistance as evidence that the other person doesn't understand the practical benefits of their approach, and they often escalate their demands rather than reconsidering their behavior. Jessica wouldn't be deterred by family meetings, heartfelt conversations, or appeals to our relationship. She would only modify her behavior when the consequences of her demands became too expensive or too risky to ignore. I'd seen this pattern dozens of times during my career. Adult children who had convinced themselves that their takeover of their parents' properties was actually generous assistance typically didn't recognize the inappropriateness of their behavior until they faced formal legal consequences or public scrutiny that forced them to confront the reality of their actions. Marcus's enabling of Jessica's behavior was equally predictable and equally problematic. He'd convinced himself that supporting his wife's household management decisions was evidence of marital loyalty and practical thinking. He'd reframed my resistance to Jessica's demands as stubbornness or inflexibility, rather than a legitimate assertion of my rights as the homeowner. But Marcus's psychology was different from Jessica's. Where Jessica saw efficiency and practical optimization, Marcus saw family harmony and conflict avoidance. He wasn't trying to take control of my property. He was trying to keep everyone happy by supporting what seemed like reasonable compromises and practical solutions. This meant that Marcus might be more responsive to clear information about the legal and financial realities of our situation. If he understood that Jessica's demands were actually boundary violations that could have serious legal consequences, he might be willing to reconsider his support for her behavior. But it also meant that Marcus would likely be devastated when he realized the true nature of what Jessica was doing and what he'd been enabling. He'd raised to respect property ownership and family relationships, and discovering that he'd been participating in the systematic displacement of his own mother from her own home would create significant guilt and confusion. I'd seen this dynamic in other families where adult children had been manipulated into enabling inappropriate behavior by spouses who were more skilled at psychological manipulation. The adult children often became the most vocal advocates for correcting the situation once they understood what had really been happening. But they also experienced significant emotional trauma when they realized how they'd been used. Based on my professional experience and my understanding of the psychological dynamics involved, I had several strategic options for addressing Jessica's behavior. Option 1. Direct legal action. I could provide immediate written notice requiring them to vacate the property within 30 days, followed by formal eviction proceedings if they refused to comply. This approach would be swift and legally definitive, but it would likely destroy my relationship with Marcus and create lasting family trauma. Option 2. Graduated consequences. I could begin with clear communication about property ownership and boundaries, escalate to formal documentation of their legal status, and proceed to legal action only if they refuse to modify their behavior. This approach would give them opportunities to correct course while building a strong legal foundation for more serious consequences if necessary. Option 3. Strategic alliance building. I could involve neutral third parties, family friends, community members, or professionals who could help Marcus understand the inappropriate nature of Jessica's behavior and the legal risks they were creating. This approach would provide external validation of my concerns while giving Marcus face-saving opportunities to address the situation. Option 4. Financial leverage. I could begin charging market-rate rent for their residence, making their continued presence in my home financially unsustainable while they saved for their own property. This approach would force them to confront the economic reality of their housing situation while providing clear documentation of their legal status as tenants rather than family members with property rights. Each option had advantages and risks, and the best approach would depend on how Jessica and Marcus responded to initial attempts at boundary setting and education about the legal realities of their situation. But regardless of which strategy I ultimately chose, I knew that Jessica's Bedroom demand represented a line that couldn't be crossed without serious consequences. Allowing her to relocate me to a storage room would establish a precedent that would make future boundary violations even more difficult to address. What Jessica also didn't understand was that her treatment of me was being observed by neighbors, family, friends, and community members who had known me for decades and who understood both my professional background and my character. Her systematic displacement of me from my own living spaces hadn't gone unnoticed, and her demand that I relocate to a storage room would likely generate community concern and scrutiny that she wasn't prepared to handle. Margaret Thompson, my neighbor of 15 years and retired school principal, had already commented to me about the changes she'd observed in my home and my routine. "Eleanor, I've noticed that your sunroom looks different, and I haven't seen you having your morning coffee there lately. Is everything all right with your living situation?" Dr. Patricia Williams, my longtime physician and personal friend, had asked during my last appointment whether I was experiencing any stress or changes in my home environment that might be affecting my sleep or appetite. She'd noticed subtle changes in my demeanor that suggested I was dealing with ongoing tension or conflict. Robert Martinez, the president of our neighborhood association and a retired attorney, had mentioned during a recent community meeting that he'd heard from several neighbors who were concerned about changes they'd observed in my household and wanted to make sure I wasn't experiencing any problems that the association should be aware of. These community members weren't just casual acquaintances. They were people who had known me for years, who understood my professional background and my character, and who had the social standing and expertise to validate my concerns if this situation became public. If Jessica continued to push her demands and force a confrontation, she would find herself defending her behavior not just to me, but to a community of people who had decades of experience with my judgment, my professional competence, and my reasonable approach to problem solving. The storage room demand, in particular, would be difficult for anyone to defend as appropriate or reasonable. Community members who learned that Jessica was trying to relocate me to a converted closet so she could take over my bedroom would likely view her behavior as elder abuse rather than practical household management. Beyond my immediate community, I also had access to a professional network that included attorneys, social workers, elder advocacy specialists, and law enforcement professionals who would view Jessica's behavior as a serious violation of my rights as an elderly homeowner. The Oregon Department of Human Services had specific protocols for investigating elder abuse situations, including cases where family members were systematically displacing elderly homeowners from their own properties. If this situation escalated to formal complaints, Jessica could find herself facing investigations that would examine her behavior over the past 8 months and her systematic takeover of my living spaces. The Riverside County Elder Advocacy Center provided legal assistance and support services for elderly homeowners who were experiencing inappropriate pressure or manipulation from family members. Their attorneys had handled dozens of cases similar to mine, and they had the resources and expertise to provide both legal protection and community support if I needed formal assistance. More significantly, the professional network I'd built during my career included people who had the authority and expertise to validate my concerns and provide credible testimony about the appropriateness of Jessica's behavior. These weren't just personal friends offering emotional support. They were professionals who understood property law, elder rights, and family dynamics well enough to provide expert opinions about the situation I was facing. Judge Patricia Hendricks, in particular, had seen enough family property disputes to recognize the warning signs of systematic elder manipulation. If this situation ended up in her courtroom, she would evaluate Jessica's behavior against established patterns of inappropriate conduct rather than treating it as an isolated family disagreement. But perhaps most importantly, I had financial resources and independence that Jessica and Marcus had never bothered to investigate or understand. My assumption that I was a financially dependent elderly widow living on a fixed income was completely incorrect, and their miscalculation of my economic position was about to become a significant factor in how this situation resolved. Beyond owning my home free and clear, I had retirement accounts, investment portfolios, and savings that provided me with substantial financial security and independence. My total net worth, including property value, investment accounts, and liquid savings, exceeded $2 million, making me financially secure enough to pursue any legal action necessary to protect my rights without concern about cost. More significantly, I had the financial resources to provide Marcus and Jessica with alternatives that would address their stated needs without requiring me to sacrifice my comfort and privacy. I could offer to help them with a down payment on their own home, assist with first-year mortgage payments, or provide other financial support that would enable them to establish their own household without displacing me from mine. But I also had the financial independence to pursue consequences that would make their continued residence in my home untenable if they refused to respect my authority as the homeowner. I could afford to hire attorneys, pursue formal eviction proceedings, obtain restraining orders, or take any other legal action necessary to protect my rights. Jessica's assumption that I needed their assistance, and would therefore be willing to accept unreasonable compromises to maintain their presence, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my actual situation. I didn't need them to help me manage my household, my finances, or my daily activities. I'd welcome them into my home as a generous gesture to help them save money, not as a necessity for my own well-being. As I documented Jessica's behavior and researched my options, I realized that we were approaching a turning point that would determine the long-term trajectory of our family relationships. Jessica's bedroom demand represented a level of boundary violation that couldn't be ignored or accommodated without establishing precedents that would make future violations even more likely and more serious. If I agreed to relocate to the storage room, I would be validating Jessica's authority to make unilateral decisions about my living arrangements. The next demand would be restrictions on my use of common areas during her business hours. Then limitations on visitors who might interfere with their professional activities. Then suggestions that I should consider more appropriate housing, arrangements that would give them complete control over the property. But if I refused to accept the bedroom demand, and instead asserted my authority as the homeowner, I would be forcing Jessica and Marcus to confront the reality of their legal status and the inappropriateness of their expectations. They would have to choose between respecting my boundaries and facing the consequences of their refusal to acknowledge my rights. The woman they'd been systematically underestimating for 8 months was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when you tried to push around someone who actually owned the property you were trying to reorganize. The burdensome elderly relative they thought they could manage was about to become the homeowner whose legal authority they'd never bothered to investigate. And the storage room they wanted to relocate me to was about to become the command center for the most educational experience either of them would ever have about property ownership, family boundaries, and the consequences of underestimating Eleanor Walsh. 2 weeks remained until their proposed moving timeline. I had 14 days to prepare them for a lesson in property law and family respect that would change their understanding of our situation forever. The woman who had spent 45 years helping other people handle exactly this type of conflict was about to demonstrate that experience and expertise didn't disappear just because someone decided you were too old to manage your own household. And it was going to be absolutely enlightening. What Jessica and Marcus discovered the next morning was that the confused elderly woman they'd successfully maneuvered into accepting bedroom relocation had spent her first night in the master suite making phone calls to legal professionals who remembered Eleanor Walsh as one of the most formidable property rights advocates in Oregon's history, and that the helpless mother, who had quietly listened to their room optimization plans, was now sitting at her kitchen table with a stack of legal documents that could change their living situation in ways they had never imagined possible. While Jessica celebrated her successful negotiation by measuring the master bedroom for her new office furniture, the reality was that Eleanor Patricia Walsh had been methodically building what was about to become the most comprehensive legal response to family property boundary violations that Riverside County had seen in over a decade. What Marcus and Jessica had interpreted as elderly confusion and reluctant acceptance was actually the calm, systematic approach of someone who had spent 45 years preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. But here's what happens. When you systematically underestimate someone whose professional expertise was built specifically around the situation you've just created, you discover that every assumption you've made about their capabilities, their resources, and their willingness to defend their rights has been catastrophically wrong. The first phone call I made at 7:30 a.m. was to attorney Michael Chen, who had handled more than 300 family property disputes during his 20-year career, and who had collaborated with me on some of the most complex elder rights cases in Oregon's legal history. Michael and I had worked together on situations that were remarkably similar to what I was now experiencing. Adult children who had moved into elderly parents' homes and gradually assumed control over living arrangements while systematically undermining the homeowner's authority. "Eleanor, I was wondering when I'd hear from you," Michael said when his secretary connected our call. "Margaret Thompson called me yesterday evening. She's concerned about some changes she's observed in your household situation and wanted to know if there were legal resources available if you needed assistance with family boundary issues." Margaret Thompson, my neighbor and retired school principal, had been more observant and more proactive than I'd realized. Her casual questions about my living situation hadn't been polite conversation. They'd been fact-finding inquiries from someone who understood institutional dynamics and who had recognized the warning signs of systematic manipulation. "Michael, I need to discuss a developing situation with Marcus and Jessica. They've been living in my home for 8 months, and Jessica has been systematically taking control of common areas while positioning herself as the decision-maker for household management. Yesterday, she demanded that I relocate to a converted storage room so she can take over my master bedroom for her business office." "Eleanor, that's textbook elder manipulation with property boundary violations. How much documentation do you have of the pattern of behavior?" "Complete documentation going back 8 months. Timeline of space takeovers, quotes from conversations, where my authority was undermined, financial records showing my sole property ownership, and detailed analysis of their legal status as guests without tenant protections." "That's exactly what I'd expect from you. Eleanor, you've built a stronger foundation for this type of case than most attorneys could assemble in 6 months of preparation. What outcome are you looking for? I want them to understand the legal reality of their situation and modify their behavior accordingly. If they're willing to respect my authority as the homeowner and acknowledge appropriate boundaries, I'm open to continued residence with clear agreements about household management. If they're not willing to respect those boundaries, I want them to relocate voluntarily with sufficient time to find appropriate housing. And if they refuse both options, then I want formal eviction proceedings initiated with the full documentation necessary to demonstrate that their removal is justified based on boundary violations and inappropriate behavior toward the property owner. Eleanor, I can have the preliminary legal documents prepared by tomorrow afternoon. 30-day notice to vacate, formal demand for acknowledgement of property ownership, and comprehensive documentation package for court proceedings if necessary. But I want to suggest a preliminary step that might resolve this without formal legal action. What do you have in mind?" "A property rights consultation meeting where I explain their legal status, your authority as the homeowner, and the potential consequences of continued boundary violations. Sometimes adult children who have convinced themselves that their behavior is helpful assistance will modify their approach when they understand the legal implications of their actions." "Michael, that's exactly what I was hoping you'd suggest. When can we schedule that meeting?" "How about tomorrow evening? That gives them 24 hours to prepare for the conversation, and it demonstrates that you're approaching this professionally rather than emotionally." The property rights consultation meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in my living room. Michael would explain the legal framework governing family housing arrangements. Jessica and Marcus would learn about their actual legal status, and I would present my expectations for future behavior with the backing of professional legal authority. But more importantly, The meeting would serve as an educational experience that would help them understand exactly what they'd been attempting to do and why their approach had been inappropriate from both legal and ethical perspectives. The second call I made was to Judge Patricia Hendricks, who had handled more family property disputes than any other judicial officer in Oregon, and who had worked with me on cases that had established legal precedents for protecting elderly homeowners from manipulation by family members. Eleanor, Patricia Thompson called my chambers yesterday afternoon. She's concerned about a situation developing in your neighborhood and wanted to know what legal protections were available for elderly homeowners experiencing pressure from family members. I told her that if Eleanor Walsh needed legal protection, she had more resources and expertise than most attorneys, but I'd be happy to provide guidance if the situation required judicial intervention. Judge Hendricks had been tracking my situation through community connections before I'd even realized that my neighbors were building a support network around me. The professional relationships I'd built during my career had evolved into a community of people who understood my character and my capabilities, and who were prepared to validate my concerns if this situation required formal legal proceedings. Patricia, I'm dealing with systematic boundary violations from my daughter-in-law, who has been gradually taking control of my living spaces and has now demanded that I relocate to a storage room so she can take over my master bedroom. I'm scheduling a property rights consultation meeting with Michael Chen to educate them about the legal realities of their situation. Eleanor, that's the appropriate first step, but I want you to know that if this situation escalates to formal proceedings, you'll have my full attention and support. I've seen too many cases where elderly homeowners were systematically displaced from their own properties by family members who convinced themselves that their takeover was actually assistance. I appreciate that, Patricia. My goal is resolution, through education rather than litigation, but I want them to understand that formal legal protections are available if they choose to ignore professional guidance. Eleanor, you've handled these situations from the legal side for decades. Now, you're experiencing it from the personal side. Trust your professional instincts, document everything, and don't hesitate to escalate if they don't respond appropriately to clear boundaries and legal education. The third call was to Sheriff Tom Bradley, who supervised residential property enforcement for Riverside County and who had worked with me on numerous family housing disputes where law enforcement intervention had been necessary to resolve conflicts and protect homeowners' rights. Eleanor, good to hear from you. We've had several community members contact the department with concerns about potential elder abuse situations in your neighborhood. Margaret Thompson filed an informal inquiry about resources available for elderly homeowners experiencing pressure from family members, and Dr. Patricia Williams contacted our elder advocacy unit about warning signs she'd observed that suggested you might be experiencing household stress or manipulation. My professional network hadn't just remained available for consultation. They'd been actively monitoring my situation and building protective resources around me before I'd even asked for assistance. The community of professionals who had worked with me during my career understood both my capabilities and my character well enough to recognize when I might be facing challenges that required external support. Tom, I'm dealing with systematic boundary violations from family members who have been living in my home for 8 months. The situation has escalated to demands that I relocate within my own property to accommodate their business needs. I'm scheduling a property rights consultation meeting with Michael Chen to provide legal education about their status and my authority as the homeowner. Eleanor, that's the right approach. Education first, formal consequences if education doesn't work. But I want you to know that we've already flagged your address for priority response if you need assistance with family members who refuse to respect your authority or who become hostile when confronted with legal realities. I don't anticipate hostility, but I appreciate the preparation. These are good people who have convinced themselves that their behavior is helpful rather than inappropriate. Once they understand the legal framework, I expect they'll modify their approach accordingly. Eleanor, in my experience, people who gradually push boundaries often escalate their behavior when they're first confronted with formal resistance. Be prepared for the possibility that they might react defensively or try to increase pressure rather than acknowledging that they've been inappropriate. Tom, I've been handling these situations professionally for 45 years. I understand the psychology and the typical behavior patterns, but I also understand that this is my son we're talking about, and I believe he'll respond appropriately when he understands what's really been happening. While my professional network prepared to provide legal support and protective resources, I began assembling the financial documentation that would demonstrate my independence and authority as the sole property owner. Jessica and Marcus had never asked about mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance costs, or any of the financial responsibilities that come with homeownership. They'd simply assumed that housing costs were somehow shared, or that their presence was financially beneficial to me. The reality was that their residence in my home had actually increased my expenses without providing any financial compensation. Utility costs had risen substantially due to Jessica's home office equipment and extended working hours. Water usage had nearly doubled due to their daily routines and Jessica's frequent client meetings that required additional cleaning and preparation. The heating and cooling costs had increased because Jessica preferred different temperature settings than I'd maintained when living alone. More significantly, Jessica's business activities had created additional insurance liability that required policy modifications and increased premiums. Her client meetings in my home meant that my homeowner's insurance needed to cover commercial activities and potential property damage from business-related use. The policy changes had cost me an additional $1,200 annually, expense that I'd absorbed without asking them for compensation. I documented every financial impact of their residence, from increased utility costs to additional insurance premiums, to accelerated wear and tear on furnishings and appliances due to increased usage. The total additional cost of their 8-month residence exceeded $4,800, not including the opportunity cost of lost rental income if I'd chosen to rent the space, to paying tenants. But more importantly, I documented my complete financial independence and the substantial resources that made their assistance unnecessary. Bank statements showing healthy checking and savings account balances, investment portfolio statements demonstrating diversified holdings worth over $400,000, retirement account documentation showing systematic contributions and growth over 4 decades, property tax records showing timely payments and current assessed value of $850,000, my total net worth, including property equity, investment accounts, retirement savings, and liquid assets, exceeded $1.2 million. I had more than sufficient resources to maintain my household independently, to pursue any legal action necessary to protect my rights, and to provide financial assistance to Marcus and Jessica if they needed help establishing their own household. The financial documentation package I assembled would demonstrate to anyone reviewing the situation that I wasn't a financially dependent elderly woman who needed family assistance. I was a financially secure homeowner who had generously provided temporary housing to family members who had gradually misinterpreted my generosity as dependence and my hospitality as vulnerability. Beyond personal financial documentation, I also assembled comprehensive evidence of my sole ownership and authority over the property. The original purchase documents from 1995, showing my name as the sole buyer and borrower. The mortgage documentation showing systematic payments made from my personal accounts over 25 years. The mortgage satisfaction letter from 2020, proving that the property was owned free and clear with no liens or encumbrances. Property tax records going back 15 years, showing my responsibility for all ownership costs and my consistent, timely payments. Insurance policies and claims history demonstrating my management of property protection and maintenance. Utility account records showing my responsibility for all household operating expenses. Building permits and inspection records for improvements. And renovations I'd completed over the years, including the master bathroom renovation in 2018 and the kitchen upgrade in 2019. All work had been permitted. inspected, and paid for through my personal accounts, demonstrating both my financial capability and my long-term investment in the property. The deed registered with Riverside County, showing Eleanor Patricia Walsh as the sole owner with no co-owners, joint tenants or other parties with ownership interests. Property assessment records showing current fair market value, and my responsibility for property taxes based on that valuation. Most importantly, documentation showing the complete absence of any legal agreements, rental contracts, or other documentation that would give Marcus and Jessica tenant rights or ownership interests. Their residence had been based on informal family arrangements that could be terminated with appropriate notice, and they had no legal protections that would prevent me from requiring them to relocate if they refused to respect my authority as the homeowner. I also assembled documentation of my professional background and expertise that would establish my credibility and competence if this situation required formal legal proceedings or community intervention. My employment history with Riverside County Property Management, including job descriptions, performance evaluations, and recognition for specialized expertise in family property disputes. Certificates and credentials from real estate law courses, property management programs, and continuing education in residential housing regulations. Professional recognition including the Oregon Real Estate Journal feature article, the state legislature testimony invitation, and the Portland State University guest lecture opportunities that Marcus and Jessica had dismissed as inappropriate. Commitments for someone my age. Letters of recommendation from colleagues, supervisors, and professional associates who could attest to my competence, my judgment, and my ethical approach to complex property disputes. Contact information for professional references who could provide expert testimony about my capabilities and my reputation in the property management and real estate law communities. Professional association memberships and continuing education. Records that demonstrated my ongoing commitment to staying current with legal changes and best practices in property management. Awards and recognition for innovative approaches to family housing disputes and elder property protection advocacy. The professional credentials package would establish that Eleanor Walsh wasn't a confused elderly woman who needed management by family members. I was a retired property law specialist with decades of experience handling situations exactly like the one I was currently facing, and my professional expertise was recognized and respected by colleagues throughout Oregon's real estate and legal communities. As I prepared for the property rights consultation meeting, I also documented the community support network that had developed around my situation. Margaret Thompson's inquiries about legal resources, Dr. Patricia Williams's concerns about stress and household changes, Robert Martinez's questions about community association support for elderly residents experiencing family conflicts. These weren't casual acquaintances offering emotional support. They were respected community members with professional expertise, who had observed changes in my situation and who were prepared to provide validation and testimony about my character and my circumstances. Margaret Thompson, as a retired school principal, understood institutional dynamics and power relationships. Her observations about changes in my routine and her proactive contact with legal resources demonstrated that knowledgeable professionals in my community had recognized warning signs of systematic manipulation. Dr. Patricia Williams, as my longtime physician, had noticed subtle changes in my demeanor and stress levels that suggested ongoing household conflict. Her contact with elder advocacy resources showed that medical professionals who knew me well were concerned about my well-being and prepared to provide support if necessary. Robert Martinez, as a retired attorney and neighborhood association president, had the legal background to recognize inappropriate family dynamics and the community standing to validate concerns about elder property rights. His involvement demonstrated that the legal community in my neighborhood was aware of my situation and prepared to provide support if formal intervention became necessary. With legal consultation scheduled, professional support network activated, and comprehensive documentation assembled, I established a strategic timeline for addressing Jessica's bedroom demand and the broader pattern of boundary violations. Thursday evening, Property Rights Consultation Meeting with Michael Chen, present to provide legal education about housing arrangements, property ownership, and appropriate boundaries in family living situations. Friday morning. If Jessica and you, Marcus demonstrated understanding and willingness to modify their behavior. We would establish written agreements about household management, space usage, and decision-making authority that respected my role as the homeowner. Friday afternoon. If they showed resistance or continued to treat the legal education as obstacles to overcome rather than boundaries to respect, I would provide formal written notice of their legal status and my expectations for future behavior. Monday morning. If they refuse to acknowledge my authority or continue to insist on inappropriate demands, I would initiate formal legal proceedings with 30-day notice to vacate and comprehensive documentation for court review. The timeline provided multiple opportunities for voluntary resolution while building toward more serious consequences. If they chose to ignore professional guidance and legal education, each step would be documented and witnessed, creating an unassailable record of my reasonable approach to conflict resolution and their responses to clear information about legal boundaries. But beyond the legal and logistical preparation, I also prepared myself psychologically for what was likely to be the most difficult conversation I'd ever had with my son. Marcus had convinced himself that supporting Jessica's household management decisions was evidence of marital loyalty and practical thinking. Learning that his wife had been systematically violating my rights as the homeowner and that he'd been enabling behavior that could have serious legal consequences would create significant emotional conflict for him. I'd seen this dynamic in other families where adult children had been manipulated into supporting inappropriate behavior by spouses who were more skilled at psychological boundary pushing. The adult children often experienced guilt, confusion, and anger when they realized they'd been used to validate behavior that violated their own values and principles. Marcus would likely go through several emotional stages when he learned about the legal realities of our situation. Initial denial that Jessica's behavior was inappropriate or that their demands were unreasonable. Defensive anger when he realized that community members and professionals had been observing and documenting problems in our household. Guilt when he understood that he'd been enabling systematic violations of my rights as his mother and as the property owner. But eventually, if Marcus was the man I'd raised him to be, he would recognize that Jessica's behavior was wrong and that his support for her demands had been misguided. He would understand that respecting my authority as the homeowner wasn't just legally required. It was morally appropriate and consistent with the family values he'd been taught throughout his childhood. Jessica's response was more difficult to predict. People who convince themselves that their boundary violations are actually helpful assistants often react defensively when confronted with formal resistance. She might escalate her demands, insist that legal technicalities were less important than practical considerations, or position herself as the victim of an elderly woman who was being unreasonable about necessary household changes. But Jessica would also have to confront the reality that every assumption she'd made about my capabilities, my resources, and my willingness to defend my rights had been wrong. The confused elderly woman she'd been managing was actually a property law specialist with more expertise than most attorneys. The helpless mother who needed her guidance was actually a financially independent homeowner with substantial resources and professional support networks. As I completed my preparation for the property rights consultation meeting, I felt the same focused determination that had characterized my approach to complex property disputes throughout my professional career. This wasn't an emotional family conflict. It was a legal situation that required clear communication, appropriate boundaries, and systematic consequences for inappropriate behavior. I'd handled hundreds of similar situations during my career. I'd helped elderly homeowners reclaim authority over their properties, educated adult children about appropriate boundaries, and facilitated resolution of family housing conflicts that protected everyone's rights and relationships when possible. Now, I was applying that professional expertise to my own situation. With the advantages of complete documentation, strong legal support, and comprehensive understanding of all available options and potential outcomes, the storage room that Jessica wanted to relocate me to had become my command center for assembling the most thorough response to family property boundary violations that I'd ever prepared. The burdensome elderly mother they thought they could manage had demonstrated exactly what professional expertise looked like when it was applied with full documentation and legal authority. Tomorrow evening, Jessica and Marcus would discover that the woman whose preferences they'd been dismissing as obstacles to overcome was actually someone whose rights were protected by 45 years of professional expertise, comprehensive legal documentation, and a support network of professionals who understood exactly what they'd been attempting to do. The bedroom demand that they thought represented successful household optimization was about to become the catalyst for the most educational experience either of them would ever have about property ownership, family boundaries, and the consequences of underestimating Eleanor Walsh. And it was going to change everything. What Jessica discovered on Wednesday morning was that the elderly mother, who had quietly agreed to think about bedroom relocation, had spent the previous evening transforming her dining room into what looked like a legal war room, complete with document organization systems that would have impressed federal prosecutors, and a communication strategy that suggested she understood litigation procedures better than most practicing attorneys. While Jessica busily researched office, furniture, and measured window dimensions in my master bedroom, the reality was that Eleanor Patricia Walsh had been systematically implementing what was about to become the most comprehensive response to family property manipulation that Oregon's legal system had witnessed in recent memory. What Marcus and Jessica had interpreted as confused elderly deliberation was actually the methodical preparation of someone who had spent 4 decades developing strategies for exactly this type of situation. But here's what happens when you mistake professional expertise for senior confusion. You continue making decisions based on assumptions that are about to be proven catastrophically wrong, while the person you're underestimating builds an unassailable foundation for consequences you never saw coming. By Wednesday morning, my dining room had been converted into what Michael Chen would later describe as the most thorough case preparation I've seen outside of major corporate litigation. Every surface held carefully organized stacks of documentation, each category labeled with the precision that came from decades of handling complex property disputes. Property ownership documentation. Complete chain of title going back to the original property purchase. Mortgage documentation and satisfaction records. Property tax payment history, insurance policies and claims records, and building permits for all improvements and modifications. Financial independence evidence, bank statements showing substantial checking and savings balances, investment portfolio documentation worth over $400,000, retirement account statements demonstrating systematic contributions over 4 decades, and comprehensive net worth analysis exceeding $1.2 million. Professional credentials, verification, employment history with detailed job descriptions and performance evaluations, certification documentation from property law and real estate programs, professional recognition including published articles and legislative testimony, and reference letters from colleagues and supervisors spanning 45 years. Behavioral pattern documentation, timeline of Jessica's systematic space takeovers, direct quotes from conversations where my authority was undermined, photographs showing before and after changes to my living spaces, and witness statements from community members who had observed the transformation of my household. Legal status analysis. Research confirming Marcus and Jessica's classification as guests without tenant protections, documentation of the informal, arrangements under which they had moved in, analysis of their legal vulnerability to immediate eviction proceedings, and precedent cases establishing homeowner authority in similar family situations. Community support network. Contact information for professional allies prepared to provide testimony, documentation of neighbor concerns, and proactive support. evidence of community members' professional qualifications and credibility, and coordination plans for witness availability during potential legal proceedings. The organization system I'd implemented was the same approach I'd used for major corporate property disputes during my career: comprehensive, systematic, and designed to anticipate every possible challenge or objection that opposing parties might raise during litigation. But more importantly, the documentation demonstrated that this wasn't an emotional family conflict driven by hurt feelings or miscommunication. This was a legal situation involving systematic boundary violations, property rights infringement, and elder manipulation that required formal resolution through established legal procedures. Wednesday afternoon brought a series of coordination, calls with the professional network that would provide support and validation for the property rights consultation meeting scheduled for Thursday evening. Each conversation confirmed that my approach was appropriate, my documentation was comprehensive, and my legal foundation was unassailable. Call with attorney Michael Chen, 2:00 p.m. Eleanor, I've reviewed the preliminary documentation you provided, and I want you to know that you've built the strongest foundation for this type of case that I've encountered in 20 years of practice. The combination of clear property ownership, documented behavioral patterns, and comprehensive financial independence creates an unassailable legal position. Michael, what should I expect during tomorrow evening's consultation meeting? How do adult children typically respond when they learn about the legal realities of their situation? In my experience, there are 3 common reactions. First, denial that their behavior has been inappropriate, usually accompanied by insistence that practical considerations should override legal technicalities. Second, defensive anger about being ambushed with legal information, particularly when they've convinced themselves that their demands were reasonable. Third, genuine recognition that they've overstepped boundaries, followed by willingness to modify their behavior and establish appropriate agreements. Which reaction do you expect from Marcus and Jessica? Eleanor, Marcus has been raised with strong family values and respect for property ownership. Once he understands what's really been happening, I expect he'll be embarrassed about enabling inappropriate behavior and eager to correct the situation. Jessica is more difficult to predict because she's invested significant time and energy in convincing herself that her demands are practical and helpful. What if Jessica refuses to acknowledge that her behavior has been inappropriate? Then we proceed with formal legal action. Eleanor, you have everything necessary to obtain immediate court orders protecting your rights as the homeowner. If they choose to ignore professional legal guidance, they'll discover that property law provides very strong protections for elderly homeowners experiencing family manipulation. Call with Judge Patricia Hendricks, 3:30 p.m. Eleanor, I want to commend you for taking a systematic, professional approach to this situation. Too many elderly homeowners allow family boundary violations to escalate without seeking appropriate legal protection, often because they're afraid of damaging relationships or because they don't understand their rights. Patricia, I'm hoping that education and clear communication will resolve this without formal court proceedings, but I want them to understand that legal protections are available if they choose to continue inappropriate behavior. Eleanor, that's exactly the right approach. In my courtroom, I've seen too many cases where early intervention could have prevented serious family conflicts and legal trauma. Your documentation and professional preparation demonstrate that you're serious about protecting your rights, while giving them opportunities to modify their behavior voluntarily. What outcomes have you seen in similar cases? When families receive clear legal education and professional guidance, about 60% resolve conflicts through modified agreements that respect the homeowner's authority. Another 20% require formal documentation and structured boundaries but avoid court proceedings. The remaining 20% escalate to formal eviction or restraining order proceedings, usually because the adult children refuse to acknowledge that their behavior has been inappropriate. And in those cases where formal proceedings are necessary? Eleanor, homeowners with your level of documentation and professional preparation virtually always prevail. Property law provides strong protections for elderly homeowners, and judges take elder manipulation very seriously when it's properly documented and presented. Call with Sheriff Tom Bradley, 4:45 p.m. Eleanor, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to share some observations from similar situations we've handled. Adult children who gradually assume control over their parents. Living arrangements often react defensively when confronted with legal boundaries, particularly if they've convinced themselves that their behavior is helpful rather than manipulative. Tom, are you suggesting that I should be prepared for hostility? Or escalation? Not necessarily hostility, but possibly increased pressure or attempts to make you feel guilty for asserting your rights. They might suggest that legal involvement is unnecessary family drama, or that you're being unreasonable by treating practical household arrangements as legal issues. How should I respond if they try to reframe this as family conflict rather than property rights violation? Eleanor, stick to the legal facts and the documented behavior patterns. Don't allow them to redirect the conversation toward hurt feelings or family dynamics. This is about property ownership, appropriate boundaries, and their legal status as guests in your home. What if they refuse to participate in the consultation meeting or dismiss the legal information as irrelevant? Then you proceed with formal legal action immediately. Eleanor, you've provided them with an opportunity for education and voluntary resolution. If they choose to ignore professional guidance, they're demonstrating that formal legal intervention is necessary to protect your rights. Based on guidance from my professional network, I developed a communication strategy for the property rights consultation meeting that would maximize the likelihood of voluntary resolution while building a strong foundation for formal legal action, if education proved insufficient. Phase 1. Legal education. Michael Chen would present the legal framework governing family housing arrangements, explaining the difference between tenant rights and guest privileges, clarifying the homeowner's authority over property usage and living arrangements, and outlining the legal consequences of boundary violations and property rights infringement. Phase 2. Documented behavior review. I would present the timeline of Jessica's systematic space takeovers, the documented pattern of boundary violations, and the escalation from suggestions to demands that culminated in the bedroom relocation requirement. Phase 3. Financial reality presentation. I would provide comprehensive documentation of my sole property ownership, my financial independence and substantial resources, and the absence of any legal agreements giving them tenant rights or property interests. Phase 4. Boundary establishment. We would present clear expectations for future behavior, including acknowledgement of my authority as the homeowner, restoration of my access to all areas of my property, and establishment of written agreements about household management that respected property ownership hierarchy. Phase 5. Consequence. Clarification. Michael Chen would explain the legal options available if they chose to continue inappropriate behavior, including formal eviction proceedings, restraining orders for elder manipulation, and financial liability for property damage, or unauthorized modifications. Phase 6. Timeline for decision. They would be given 48 hours to demonstrate understanding and compliance with appropriate boundaries, after which formal legal action would commence if voluntary resolution proved impossible. The communication strategy was designed to provide maximum education and opportunity for voluntary compliance while creating comprehensive documentation for court proceedings if they chose to ignore professional legal guidance. Wednesday evening brought coordination calls with community, members who had observed the changes in my household and who were prepared to provide witness testimony about Jessica's systematic displacement of me from my own living spaces. Call with Margaret Thompson, 6:00 p.m. Eleanor, I've been documenting the changes I've observed in your routine and your access to different areas of your property. the transformation of your sunroom from reading space to business office, the elimination of your morning coffee ritual in that room, and the overall change in your demeanor over the past 8 months. Margaret, would you be willing to provide written documentation of your observations if formal legal proceedings become necessary? Absolutely. Eleanor, I've been a school principal for 30 years, and I understand institutional dynamics and power relationships. What I've observed in your household represents systematic displacement and authority undermining that would be inappropriate in any institutional setting. What specific changes have you documented? The complete reorganization of your living spaces to accommodate Jessica's business activities, the elimination of your access to areas you'd used for decades, the change in your schedule and routine to accommodate their preferences, and the overall shift in household authority from you to Jessica over the past 8 months. Margaret, I appreciate your willingness to provide professional validation of the situation. Eleanor, this isn't just about providing validation. What I've observed represents a form of institutional abuse that I've seen in educational settings. When administrators gradually undermine teachers' authority and classroom management, the pattern is identical, and the outcomes are predictably harmful if not addressed through formal intervention. Call with Dr. Patricia Williams, 7:15 p.m. Eleanor, from a medical perspective, I've observed stress indicators and behavioral changes that suggest you've been experiencing ongoing household conflict and psychological pressure. Changes in sleep, patterns, elevated stress levels during appointments, and subtle indicators of someone who is dealing with systematic undermining of their authority and autonomy. Patricia, would you be able to provide medical documentation of the stress impacts if formal proceedings become necessary? Yes, and I want you to know that what you're experiencing falls under the medical definition of elder psychological abuse. Systematic displacement from living spaces, undermining of household authority, and pressure to accept unreasonable living arrangements all constitute forms of elder manipulation that have documented negative health impacts. What kind of medical evidence would be relevant in legal proceedings? Documentation of stress-related symptoms, changes in sleep and appetite patterns, elevated blood pressure during periods of household conflict, and overall psychological impact of systematic boundary violations. Eleanor, from a medical perspective, Jessica's behavior represents a threat to your health and well-being that justifies formal legal protection. Call with Robert Martinez, 8:30 p.m. Eleanor, from a legal perspective, I've been observing changes in your household that represent clear violations of property ownership rights and elder autonomy. The systematic reorganization of your living spaces without your consent, the establishment of business activities in residential property without proper agreements, and the overall assumption of authority by people who have no legal standing to make household decisions. Robert, as a retired attorney, how would you assess the legal strength of my position? Eleanor, you have one of the strongest elder rights cases I've encountered in 30 years of practice. Clear property ownership, documented behavioral patterns, comprehensive financial independence, and systematic boundary violations that are clearly documented and witnessed by credible community members. What legal outcomes would you expect if formal proceedings become necessary? Immediate court orders protecting your rights as the homeowner, formal eviction proceedings with accelerated timeline due to elder abuse concerns and possible restraining, orders preventing future contact if they demonstrate hostility or retaliation. Eleanor, judges take elder property manipulation very seriously, particularly when it's as well documented as your situation. While coordinating professional and community support, I also analyzed the financial aspects of Marcus and Jessica's situation that would influence their response to legal education and boundary establishment. Understanding their actual financial position and housing options would help me anticipate their reactions and prepare appropriate responses to potential objections or resistance. Their financial reality. Marcus earned approximately $85,000 annually as a software developer, while Jessica's consulting business generated irregular income averaging $35,000 annually. Their combined income of $120,000 was sufficient to support independent housing, but they had minimal savings due to poor financial management and lifestyle choices that prioritized current spending over long-term financial security. Their housing options. Current market conditions in Riverside offered numerous rental options within their budget range, from $2,200 to $2,800 monthly for appropriate two-bedroom housing. Purchase options were also available with FHA loans requiring minimal down payments, particularly given Marcus's stable employment and good credit history. Their savings timeline. Based on their claimed goal of saving for a house down payment, their current financial management suggested they were saving approximately $801,000 monthly. At that rate, they would need 18 to 24 months to accumulate sufficient funds for a down payment on starter housing in their price range. Their motivation analysis. Their resistance to immediate relocation likely stemmed from financial convenience, rather than genuine inability to afford independent housing. Living in my home allowed them to save money while enjoying space and amenities that exceeded what they could afford in rental housing. This financial analysis revealed that their continued residence in my home was a matter of preference rather than necessity, and that their resistance to boundaries was motivated by desire to maintain financial advantages rather than genuine need for housing assistance. Based on my professional experience with family property disputes and my understanding of Marcus and Jessica's personalities, I developed psychological strategies for the consultation meeting that would maximize the likelihood of productive outcomes while preparing for potential defensive reactions. Marcus's psychology. As my son, Marcus had been raised with strong values about respecting authority, honoring family relationships, and taking responsibility for his actions. His enabling of Jessica's behavior likely stemmed from conflict avoidance and desire to maintain marital harmony rather than genuine belief that her demands were appropriate. Once he understood the legal and ethical implications of their behavior, his core values would likely motivate him to correct the situation and restore appropriate boundaries. Jessica's psychology. Jessica had convinced herself that her systematic takeover of my living spaces was practical household optimization rather than boundary violation. Her demands were framed as efficiency improvements that benefited everyone, and she likely genuinely believed that my resistance was evidence of inflexibility rather than appropriate assertion of property rights. Confronting her with legal education would force her to choose between acknowledging that her behavior was inappropriate or escalating her demands in the face of professional opposition. Defensive reaction. Preparation. Both Marcus and Jessica might initially react defensively to legal education, particularly if they felt ambushed by formal legal consultation. They might insist that family relationships should override legal technicalities or that practical considerations justified their approach to household management. Preparing for these reactions would allow me to redirect conversations toward documented facts and legal realities rather than emotional justifications. Resolution pathway strategy. The most likely path to voluntary resolution involved helping Marcus understand that supporting appropriate boundaries was consistent with his values and beneficial to long-term family relationships, while helping Jessica understand that her business goals could be achieved through independent housing rather than displacement of elderly family members. For the consultation meeting, I prepared a presentation strategy that would deliver legal education and boundary establishment in a way that maximized understanding while minimizing defensive reactions. Visual documentation. Photographs showing the before and after transformation of my living spaces, timeline charts documenting the progression of boundary violations, and financial summaries demonstrating my independence and their lack of legal standing. Professional validation. Letters from community members documenting observed changes, professional references confirming my expertise and credibility, and legal precedents establishing homeowner authority in similar family situations. Clear consequences. written documentation of legal options available if voluntary resolution proved impossible, timeline for formal legal action if boundaries continued to be violated, and evidence of professional support network prepared to assist with litigation, if necessary, resolution options, specific proposals for modified living arrangements that respected my authority while accommodating their business needs, timeline for transition to independent housing with offers of financial assistance, and written agreements that would govern future interactions if they chose to remain in temporary residence. The presentation strategy was designed to provide comprehensive education while offering multiple pathways for voluntary resolution that preserved relationships while protecting my rights as the homeowner. Thursday morning brought final preparation for the consultation meeting that would determine whether this situation could be resolved through education and voluntary compliance or would require formal legal intervention to protect my rights. I reviewed all documentation one final time, ensuring that every aspect of my legal position was clearly established and professionally presented. I practiced delivering key points in a way that conveyed authority and determination while remaining open to productive dialogue and voluntary resolution. Most importantly, I prepared myself psychologically for the possibility that Marcus and Jessica might refuse to acknowledge the inappropriateness of their behavior, or might react defensively to clear information about legal boundaries and consequences. The storage room that Jessica had designated as my new living space sat empty and ready for conversion to her office space, representing her confidence that I would comply with her demands rather than assert my authority as the homeowner. Tomorrow evening, she would discover that the confused elderly mother she thought she had successfully managed was actually someone whose professional expertise and legal resources far exceeded anything she had imagined possible. The bedroom that she had measured for office furniture was about to become the catalyst for the most educational experience she would ever have about property ownership, elder rights, and the consequences of systematically underestimating Eleanor Walsh. And the consultation meeting that I had arranged was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when 45 years of professional expertise was applied to protecting the rights of someone who refused to be displaced from her own home. The woman they had been treating like a manageable elderly relative was about to reveal herself as someone whose legal authority and professional credibility could change their living situation in ways they had never considered possible, and it was going to be absolutely transformative. The Thursday evening that would become known in our family as the property rights education began with Jessica confidently arranging her new office furniture catalogs on my dining room table, completely unaware that the same table was about to become the site of the most comprehensive legal education she would ever receive about property ownership, elder rights, and the catastrophic consequences of underestimating Eleanor Patricia Walsh. At exactly 7 p.m., attorney Michael Chen arrived at my front door carrying a briefcase that contained legal documents Jessica and Marcus had never imagined existed, while the confused elderly woman they'd been managing prepared to demonstrate exactly what 45 years of property law expertise looked like when it was applied with full legal authority and professional documentation. "Good evening, Marcus and Jessica," Michael began as we gathered in my living room, the same living room that Jessica had systematically redesigned to accommodate her aesthetic preferences while eliminating my personal belongings. "Eleanor has asked me to provide legal education about family housing arrangements, property ownership rights, and the legal framework that governs your current living situation." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Jessica's confident demeanor shifted to cautious attention as she realized this wasn't a family discussion about household management. This was a formal legal consultation with an attorney who clearly understood property law better than she'd expected. "I want to begin by clarifying the legal relationship that exists between Eleanor as the homeowner and you as residents in her property," Michael continued, opening his briefcase and retrieving documents that would fundamentally change their understanding of their situation. "Eleanor Patricia Walsh is the sole owner of this property, as evidenced by the deed recorded with Riverside County, the mortgage satisfaction letter proving the property is owned free and clear, and 28 years of property tax payments and maintenance records. She has complete legal authority over all aspects of property usage, living arrangements, and household management decisions. I watched Jessica's face as the first piece of information registered. For 8 months, she had been making decisions about household management as if she had equal authority with me over property usage and living arrangements. The realization that she had no legal standing to make any of those decisions was beginning to dawn on her. Marcus and Jessica, your legal status in this household is that of guests rather than tenants. You have no written lease agreement, you pay no rent, and you have no legal protections that would prevent Eleanor from requiring you to relocate with appropriate notice. Wait, Jessica interrupted, her voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty. I'd heard from her in months. We've been living here for 8 months. We've established residency. Don't we have tenant rights? No, Michael replied firmly. Tenant rights require formal rental agreements, payment of rent, and landlord-tenant relationships that don't exist in your situation. You are guests in Eleanor's home, and your continued residence depends entirely on her willingness to accommodate your presence. Marcus had been unusually quiet during the initial legal education, but his expression suggested he was beginning to understand the gravity of their situation. Michael, we moved in to help my mother with daily tasks and household management. We've been trying to optimize the living spaces to benefit everyone in the family. Marcus, I understand your intentions were good, but legal relationships aren't determined by intentions. They're determined by property ownership, formal agreements, and documented arrangements. Your mother doesn't need assistance with household management, and your attempts to optimize her living spaces constitute unauthorized modifications to someone else's property. Now, I'd like Eleanor to present documentation of the behavioral patterns that have led to this consultation, Michael said, gesturing toward the comprehensive documentation I'd prepared over the past week. I retrieved the timeline I'd assembled and began presenting 8 months of systematic boundary violations that Jessica and Marcus were seeing organized and documented for the first time. In July, Jessica took control of my sunroom and converted it to her business office, effectively eliminating my morning coffee routine and my access to my favorite room in the house. I began, showing photographs of the before and after transformation. In August, Jessica established control over the kitchen during prime cooking hours, relegating me to simple meals during off-peak times while she prepared elaborate client dinners using my kitchen equipment and utilities. In September, Jessica redesigned my living room, replacing my comfortable furniture with pieces that looked professional but were uncomfortable for daily use, and removing my personal belongings to create what she called clean, uncluttered surfaces. In October through February, Jessica continued expanding her control over common areas while positioning herself as the decision-maker for household management, treating my preferences as obstacles to overcome rather than wishes to respect. And this week, Jessica demanded that I relocate to a converted storage room so she could take over my master bedroom for her business office. As I presented each documented incident, I could see Jessica's confidence crumbling as she realized that what she'd interpreted as successful household optimization had actually been systematic displacement of the homeowner from her own living spaces. Eleanor, Jessica said, her voice now clearly defensive, I was trying to help make the house more functional for everyone. I was trying to create efficient use of the available space. Jessica, I replied, you were taking control of my property without my consent and treating me like a tenant rather than the homeowner. Every decision you made prioritized your needs over my comfort and privacy in my own home. Now I'd like to address the financial assumptions that seem to underlie your approach to this living arrangement, I continued, retrieving documentation that would shatter their perception of me as a financially dependent elderly woman. Jessica and Marcus, you seem to have assumed that I needed your presence for financial assistance, or that your residence here provided me with economic benefits. The reality is quite different. I presented bank statements showing substantial checking and savings account balances, investment portfolio documentation worth over $400,000, and comprehensive net worth analysis exceeding $1.2 million. My total net worth, including property equity, investment accounts, and liquid savings, exceeds $1.2 million. I have more than sufficient resources to maintain this household independently, to pursue any legal action necessary to protect my rights, and to provide financial assistance to help you establish your own housing if you choose to relocate voluntarily. The silence that followed was profound. For 8 months, Jessica and Marcus had been operating under the assumption that their presence was beneficial to me financially and practically. The documentation I'd presented demonstrated that their residence had actually increased my expenses while providing no financial compensation. Furthermore, I continued, your residence here has increased my household expenses by over $4,800 during the past 8 months, including higher utility costs, additional insurance premiums for business use, and accelerated wear on furnishings and appliances. Marcus looked genuinely shocked. Mom, I had no idea about your financial situation. I thought you might be struggling with household expenses and that our presence might be helpful. Marcus, you never asked about my financial situation. You assumed I was financially dependent without investigating the reality of my circumstances. Jessica, you've been treating me like a confused elderly woman who needs guidance and management. I think it's time you learned about my professional background and expertise. I retrieved documentation of my 45-year career as a senior property legal specialist, including job descriptions that detailed my responsibility for handling complex family property disputes, elder rights violations, and residential housing conflicts. For 45 years, I specialized in situations exactly like the one you've created. I've handled over 1,000 cases involving family members who moved into elderly relatives' homes and gradually assumed control over living arrangements. I've processed hundreds of evictions for adult children who refused to respect their parents' authority as homeowners. Jessica's face had gone completely pale as she realized that every assumption she'd made about my capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. The confused elderly woman you've been managing is actually someone who has more expertise in property law and elder rights than most practicing attorneys. The helpless mother who needed your guidance has spent 4 decades helping other elderly homeowners handle situations exactly like this one. I presented professional recognition documentation, including the Oregon Real Estate Journal feature, article, legislative testimony invitations, and university guest lecture opportunities. All the achievements that Marcus and Jessica had dismissed as inappropriate commitments for someone my age. Eleanor, Jessica whispered, I had no idea about your professional background. Why didn't you tell us about your expertise? Jessica, every time I tried to share my professional achievements, you found ways to diminish them or suggest that I was overcommitting myself at my age. So I learned to keep my expertise to myself while you continued to treat me like someone who needed your management. I also think you should understand that your behavior hasn't gone unnoticed by the community, Michael added, retrieving letters from my neighbors and professional associates. Margaret Thompson, Dr. Patricia Williams, and Robert Martinez have all documented their concerns about changes they've observed in Eleanor's household and living situation. They've been in contact with legal resources and elder advocacy services because they recognized warning signs of systematic manipulation. I presented the written statements from community members who had observed the transformation of my household and who were prepared to provide testimony about Jessica's systematic displacement of me from my own living spaces. These aren't just casual acquaintances offering emotional support, I explained. These are respected professionals who understand institutional dynamics, elder rights, and property law well enough to recognize inappropriate behavior when they observe it. Jessica looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, realizing that her systematic takeover of my living spaces had been observed and documented by credible witnesses who could provide professional testimony about the inappropriateness of her behavior. Now I need to explain the legal options available if this situation isn't resolved through voluntary boundary modification, Michael said, his tone becoming more serious. Eleanor has complete legal authority to require you to vacate this property with 30 days written notice. Given the documented pattern of boundary violations and elder manipulation, she could also pursue immediate eviction proceedings with an accelerated timeline. Furthermore, the systematic displacement of an elderly homeowner from her own living spaces constitutes elder abuse under Oregon law, which could result in restraining orders, criminal charges, and permanent prohibition. From contact with Eleanor, Jessica and Marcus exchanged looks that suggested they were beginning to understand the serious legal consequences of behavior they'd convinced themselves was helpful household management. But Eleanor has chosen to provide you with education and opportunity for voluntary resolution before pursuing formal legal action, Michael continued. This consultation meeting represents her commitment to preserving family relationships while protecting her rights as the homeowner. I want to be clear about my expectations going forward, I said, looking directly at Jessica and Marcus. I'm willing to continue accommodating your temporary residence in my home, but only under conditions that respect my authority as the homeowner and restore my access to all areas of my property. I presented a written agreement that outlined clear boundaries for future household management. Space usage. All common areas would be restored to their original purposes, with Jessica's business activities relocated to the guest bedroom or external. Office space. Decision-making. All household management decisions would be made by me as the homeowner, with Jessica and Marcus providing input only when requested. Timeline. Their residence would be explicitly temporary, with a target timeline of 6 months for them to establish independent housing. Financial arrangements. They would begin paying market rate rent of $1,800 monthly, formalizing their legal status and contributing to household expenses they'd been creating. These conditions aren't negotiable, I continued. They represent the minimum requirements for continued residence in my home. If you're not willing to accept these boundaries, you'll need to relocate within 30 days. Marcus was the first to respond, his voice heavy with emotion. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea what Jessica's behavior was doing to you, and I had no idea about your professional background or your financial situation. I've been enabling something that I never would have supported if I'd understood what was really happening. Marcus, I appreciate your recognition of the situation. The question now is whether you're willing to support appropriate boundaries and respectful behavior going forward. Absolutely. Mom, you have my complete support for whatever boundaries you need to establish. I should have been protecting your authority as the homeowner instead of enabling behavior that undermined your rights in your own home. Jessica's response was more complex and took several minutes of visible internal struggle. Eleanor, I genuinely thought I was helping optimize the household for everyone's benefit. I didn't realize that my suggestions were actually demands, or that my efficiency improvements were displacing you from your own living spaces. Jessica, the impact of your behavior doesn't change based on your intentions. The question is whether you're willing to acknowledge that your approach was inappropriate and modify your behavior accordingly. Yes. I can see that I completely misunderstood our situation and your capabilities. I'm willing to accept whatever boundaries you need to establish, and I apologize for treating you like someone who needed my management rather than respecting you as the homeowner. Over the following week, the transformation of our household was remarkable. Jessica relocated her business activities to the guest bedroom and external office space, restoring my sunroom to its original purpose as my morning coffee retreat. My kitchen schedule was returned to my control, with Jessica coordinating her cooking around my preferences rather than expecting me to adapt to her timeline. Most significantly, my living room was restored to its original comfort and functionality, with my personal belongings returned to their proper places and my furniture arrangements re-established according to my preferences rather than Jessica's aesthetic vision. The master bedroom, which Jessica had measured for office furniture just days earlier, remained my private space with its original purpose and privacy fully restored. Marcus and Jessica began paying monthly rent, formalizing their legal status, while contributing to the household expenses their residence had created. They also began actively searching for independent housing, with their target timeline moved up to 4 months rather than the original 6. In the weeks following the consultation meeting, the professional network that had supported my position provided validation that the resolution had been appropriate and successful. Eleanor, you handled that situation exactly as I would have recommended to any homeowner facing similar circumstances, Judge Patricia Hendricks commented during a follow-up. Call, education first, clear boundaries second, and formal legal action only if voluntary compliance proved impossible. Attorney Michael Chen added, Eleanor, your approach demonstrates why professional expertise matters in family conflicts. You provided them with education and opportunities for voluntary resolution while maintaining your legal authority and protecting your rights. Sheriff Tom Bradley observed, Eleanor, this is how these situations should be resolved when everyone acts reasonably and respects legal boundaries. You avoided trauma for everyone involved while ensuring that your rights were protected and appropriate behavior was established. 6 months later, Marcus and Jessica successfully purchased their own home and moved into independent housing that better suited their business needs and lifestyle preferences. The transition was positive for everyone involved, with their new space providing Jessica with the professional office environment she needed without displacing anyone from their established living arrangements. Our family relationships were stronger than they had been in years, built on mutual respect and clear understanding of boundaries, rather than the assumption and manipulation that had characterized the previous 8 months. Marcus had learned valuable lessons about supporting his mother's authority and independence, rather than enabling behavior that undermined her rights. Jessica had gained understanding about the importance of respecting property ownership and asking for permission rather than assuming authority in other people's homes. When people ask me about this experience, I tell them that the most important lesson isn't about property law or legal rights. It's about the importance of recognizing when someone is systematically undermining your authority and being willing to defend your boundaries with appropriate consequences. Lesson 1. Never assume that family relationships override property rights or legal boundaries. Love and respect require acknowledging and honoring each other's authority and autonomy. Lesson 2. Document patterns of inappropriate behavior rather than treating individual incidents as isolated problems. Systematic boundary violations require systematic responses. Lesson 3. Professional expertise and legal authority don't disappear because someone decides you're too old to manage your own affairs. Trust your knowledge and experience, especially when dealing with situations you've handled professionally. Lesson 4. Community support and professional networks provide validation and resources that can resolve conflicts more effectively than emotional appeals or family meetings. Lesson 5. The best outcomes often result from education and clear consequences rather than immediate legal action. Give people opportunities to correct their behavior while maintaining your authority to escalate if necessary. At 70 years old, I learned that the skills and expertise I'd developed during my professional career remained valuable and applicable when applied to protecting my own rights and boundaries. The experience of being systematically underestimated by family members taught me the importance of asserting my capabilities and authority rather than accepting other people's assumptions about my limitations. The storage room that Jessica had, designated as my new living space, remained empty for months after their departure, serving as a reminder of how close I'd come to accepting displacement from my own master bedroom. Eventually, I converted it into a beautiful reading nook with comfortable seating and excellent lighting, a space that reflects my preferences rather than someone else's efficiency optimization. The master bedroom that Jessica had measured for, office furniture became a symbol of the importance of defending boundaries and protecting the spaces that provide comfort and privacy. I redecorated it according to my own preferences, creating an environment that reflected my personality and needs rather than conforming to someone else's aesthetic vision. Today, when I mentor other elderly homeowners who are experiencing pressure from family members, I share this story as an example of the importance of understanding your rights, documenting inappropriate behavior, and seeking professional support when family conflicts involve property ownership and living arrangements. The woman who almost accepted relocation to a storage room because her daughter-in-law convinced her it was practical household optimization became an advocate for elderly homeowners who refuse to be displaced from their own properties by family members who mistake manipulation for assistance. The confused elderly mother, who was supposedly too old to manage her own household, demonstrated that professional expertise, legal authority, and financial independence don't have expiration dates. They just require the courage to assert them when someone tries to convince you they've disappeared. And the family dinner where Jessica announced her bedroom takeover plan became the catalyst for the most educational experience any of us ever had about property ownership, family respect, and the consequences of underestimating Eleanor Patricia Walsh. The lesson that emerged from this experience will stay with our family forever. Never assume that someone's willingness to accommodate your preferences means they've lost the authority. To establish boundaries when your requests become demands that cross the line from helpful suggestions to inappropriate manipulation. Sometimes the best way to preserve family relationships is to defend your boundaries with the full force of your expertise, your resources, and your legal authority. And sometimes the storage room someone wants to relocate you to becomes the launching point for demonstrating exactly what they underestimated when they assumed you were too old, too confused, or too dependent to protect yourself. The woman they thought they could manage taught them a lesson about respect, authority, and consequences that changed everything for the better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.